Today is Tuesday, December 6th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And as I'm out for a walk this afternoon, I'd like to talk about how we can be happy as Catholics in the 21st century. We have a very difficult challenge as Catholics. I published a talk some time ago that was titled "Why It's So Hard to Be a Catholic in the 21st Century," in this generation especially. Why it's so hard, and it's obvious if you look at the social media climate. There aren't many happy Catholics. If you look at the number of children who grow up and choose to leave the church, it's obvious that there are not many happy Catholics. If you look at the low numbers of men and women choosing to enter into religious vocations, it's obviously that there aren't many people who are happy to be Catholics. As I said, on social media, the majority of the posts posted by Catholics are unhappy, complaining about things that the Pope said or things that a bishop did, things that the priest did, complaining and complaining. It's very clear that not many people are happy being Catholics. And this really doesn't make much sense, because Catholicism is the one and only true religion. Catholicism is the truth. And the truth should make us happy. Jesus said, "The truth shall set you free." The truth should make us happy. When Jesus spoke about the Christian life, he told us that there would be difficulties that were caused by others. But he told us that if we follow his commands, if we imitate him, we will be blessed, we will be happy. The Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, you should read them if you don't know them by heart. The Beatitudes are promises that men who practice certain things will be happy, blessed. These are the Beatitudes. They begin with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," for example. "Blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek," and so on. Jesus promised his disciples that they would be happy, and yet, when we look around, we don't see many happy Catholics, and you may not be a happy Catholic yourself. I can say before God that I am a happy Catholic. I'm a happy Catholic. I wake up in the morning and I'm happy to wake up. I do my daily work and I'm happy to do my daily work. I say my prayers and I'm happy saying my prayers. When it's time for bed at night, I'm happy to go to bed. I'm happy as a Catholic. That doesn't mean that my life doesn't have problems or that I don't have failures and make mistakes, make bad decisions, have to pay for them, and go through difficult times. But those things don't affect my happiness. I have problems in my family to deal with, troubles in business and work, but these things don't affect my happiness. I can acknowledge, like anyone else, that there are problems in our country, in the church, in our families, and so on, but these things don't affect my happiness. Now, one of the reasons why Catholics living in this generation have such a difficult time being happy is because they haven't had the opportunity to study philosophy, to study true philosophy. They haven't had the opportunity to develop the mental framework, as it were, the mindset, the worldview that allows a man to be happy. They haven't developed the right mindset because they haven't studied philosophy, and they've built their lives on sand rather than on the stone, as Jesus said, or the solid ground. And because they haven't built their adult lives on the right foundation, their happiness, which is a false happiness, is frequently swept away from them. And it can be swept away by any number of external influences. It can be swept away by the sins of other people. It can be swept away by what the government does or what the church does. It can be swept away by sickness. It can be swept away by financial trouble. And they speak constantly against all of these influences as if these influences have taken away their happiness. And this is false. These influences do not have the power to take away true human happiness. When someone is perturbed or vexed in life, it's not the fault of anyone or anything outside of them. It's their own fault because they have built their life and they have tethered their own happiness to something or someone that is not worthy of that honor. And because they've tethered themselves to something or someone that cannot sustain their contentment or happiness, they end up unhappy. And we see this all through Catholic society today. And so I'd like to talk positively about this and answer the question, how can a Catholic be happy? First of all, we have to acknowledge the fact that the message of Catholicism is that we need to seek our happiness in God Himself, not in something that God has made, not in some person that God has made, not in any institution that God has made, but in God Himself. And this is very difficult. It's very difficult because we're creatures composed of body and soul. God is a pure spirit. God Himself does not appeal in any way to our flesh, to our senses. He doesn't appeal to our animal nature. He appeals to our spiritual nature. And therefore, if we are ruled by our physical, animal nature, we're not going to be able to seek our happiness in God Himself. And consequently, we're going to seek happiness in things that are inferior to God, things that are imperfect, and ultimately in things that cannot make us and keep us happy. And I know that if I were to ask 1,000 Catholics, they would all agree that we can be happy in God alone, and yet as soon as we finished the discussion, we would see them turn away and begin seeking happiness in things other than God. We'd see them complaining about things. We'd see them setting up their expectations, placing their hopes in other people and things. And so we have to realize that saying, I believe that my happiness exists in God alone, is not the same thing as actually practicing that reality. And again, this is why Catholics are not happy. Many of them say the right things, but don't practice them. And it's unfortunate that they don't practice them, because if they would, they could be happy. But the truth of the Catholic religion is that man was created by God out of love, and that man was created to be happy with God forever. And that happiness begins in this life. It's in our control, in fact. We determine whether or not that happiness begins in this life. It should. There's no excuse if it doesn't. But in order for us to begin to experience that everlasting happiness, we have to place our hope for it in God Himself and in God alone. Not in things God has made, not in institutions God has formed, not in people God has made, not in stories, not in activities, not in pleasures, but in God Himself. And in order to do this, we have to learn to live, to fulfill our potential as human beings, to fulfill the purpose for which God Himself made us. God made us to enjoy Him. He made us to love Him. He Himself is a bodiless spirit. He's a perfect spirit. He is infinite. He is unchangeable. He's eternal. He's a spirit. He has no body. He has no head, no hands, no feet. He is an eternal, unchangeable, infinite spirit. And He created us to enjoy Him, to be happy with Him forever. And this happiness will dwell in our souls, because our souls have been designed to rest in God Himself. Now the problem is that we have to live in this world. And this is what I pray all the time. When I'm just spending time in private prayer, I'll often confess and say, Lord, I believe in you. I worship you. I love you. I want to be with you forever. But what confuses me, what I don't understand, is how to live in this world. Because this world, this life, is full of so many unwanted troubles. I wish that when a person comes to faith, his life immediately would end, because that would be happy. That would make sense. We can come to realize our end, we can embrace that end, and immediately enter into God's presence to enjoy that end forever. That would be wonderful, or it appears that that would be wonderful. But God doesn't arrange that experience for us. We come to faith, we receive the graces of faith, hope, and charity. We desire to be with God forever, but God leaves us in this world. He leaves us in the flesh. He leaves us surrounded by troubles. And this is what makes the Christian life difficult. The religion itself is not difficult, but living in this life with this religion is what's difficult. And what's difficult is that we're constantly distracted from the contemplation of God Himself, which can and will satisfy us forever. We're distracted by things that appeal to our flesh, that appeal to our natural desires and appetites. We're distracted by things that call for our attention, things that are not ordered to God. We're distracted by other people. We're distracted by things other people design and produce and push on us. Now, if we would resist these things perfectly and keep our souls constantly fixed on God, we would be happy. And yet, because we are living in the flesh, and because we are inclined to these things, to these imperfect or even sinful desires, we're inclined to them, it's very, very difficult to not fall into these traps which make us unhappy. Because as soon as we turn away from God, we fall away from happiness. And again, this is in our control. To the degree that we deny ourselves and resist these distractions and focus ourselves on God Himself, we can be happy. And to the degree to which we allow ourselves to be turned away from God or turned to things that God has created rather than God himself, we set ourselves up for unhappiness. And the key in all this is that our happiness is found in God himself. In God himself. And the Christian religion, the Catholic Church, the sacred scriptures, the sacraments of the Church, all of these holy things that are given to us, they're not given to us as ends in themselves. They're simply given to us as means to this end. They're simply given to us as means to this end. However, many Catholics, even those who consider themselves to be devout, they often look upon these things in a disordered way, making them more ends than means. And when they do this, they become unhappy. I'll give you a few examples. Let's take sacred music. If you don't know, I sponsor a Catholic music radio station, and I'm a lover of sacred music. But this love of sacred music is simply a means, and I actually judge music by whether or not it leads my soul to God. And any music that leads my soul, leads my thoughts, leads my desires away from God, I have no interest in. I desire music that draws my soul into contemplation rather than that draws my soul out from contemplation. The problem is that music is performed by men, and very few men can perform music beautifully. Knowing this, I can't seek beautiful music. I can't expect beautiful music. I can't allow my expectations to long for and hang upon beautiful music. If I do, I'll be disappointed. So, for example, when I go to church, I don't go to church expecting beautiful music. I don't care if there's no music at all. Because the purpose of going to church is not to enjoy beautiful music. The purpose of going to church is to worship God. Church and church attendance should draw my soul into contemplation. The focus of my soul at church should be God himself. And if my focus when I'm at church is God himself, I will be happy. There may be music at church. There doesn't need to be music at church, but there may be music at church, and the music may not be beautiful. But that doesn't matter, because I'm not at church for music. For some people, the music at church may be more beautiful than any music they experience outside of church, and the music may serve its purpose at church and draw their souls to God. And for people who are immersed in worldly things, who aren't very devout, who are busy in the world, and that's not a criticism, because individuals are all at different points in their spiritual life. And it makes no sense to take a snapshot of any person's life and judge them according to that snapshot, because we're all works in progress and we're all at different points in our development. It really doesn't matter. It's none of our business. That's why Jesus tells us not to judge others, because our lives are profound and mysterious. They're being orchestrated by God Himself, and we can't understand anyone else's life, and we don't need to. But for some people who are immersed in worldly things, coming to church, even if the music is poor according to my tastes, my experiences, and so on, the music at church may be beautiful and sanctifying for them, and that's good. But I don't go to church looking for the music, because I don't need, at this point in my spiritual life, I don't need the assistance of any music to seek God. The same is true of art. At this point in my spiritual life, I don't need any artwork to draw my thoughts to God. I don't need a statue to help me to think about the Virgin Mary. I don't need to see a painting of the resurrection to draw my thoughts upward to these mysteries. I'm already thinking about them. The artwork and the music is not for me. At one point in my spiritual life it was. It was helpful. But at this point in my spiritual life, it's not for me. And I don't go to church hoping for beautiful music. I go to church to worship God. And that's why I can attend any Catholic church and be happy, because God is there. And the Eucharist, for a person who seeks God Himself, the Eucharist is the most perfect activity in this world. And for a person who is seeking God Himself, He's there in the Eucharist. It doesn't matter whether it's celebrated in Latin or in English or in Spanish. It doesn't matter whether it's celebrated with beautiful furnishings, whether the priest has beautiful vestments, whether the other Christians present are all devout and it doesn't matter, because the focus is God Himself. And this is what makes every Catholic Mass infinitely beautiful. God Himself is there in a unique way, in a way that He is never at our home. He is never in the woods, on a walking trail, or on a mountaintop, in the same way that He's present in the celebration of the Eucharist. A person who goes to church, goes to Mass, goes to celebrate the Eucharist, who's not there for God himself places his happiness upon some other factor not in his control. He goes there hoping the homily will be of a certain quality. He goes there hoping the music will be of a certain quality. He goes there hoping that the priest's vestments might be of a certain kind, or that other Christians present at the Mass will behave or dress in a certain way. He goes there looking to be pleased by something other than God himself. And it's no surprise that these people are unhappy. And it's not because the priest failed to do his job. It's not because the music wasn't good. It's not because the furnishings weren't nice enough, or that the artwork in the church was not beautiful enough. It's not because the other parishioners weren't reverent enough. It's because this individual soul is not rightly oriented. His unhappiness is no one's fault but his own, because he is looking to things other than God for his happiness. And like I said before, he will never admit that he does this. He would never admit that he seeks his happiness in something else. And yet the fact that he is unhappy reveals that he does so. And, unsurprisingly, he's let down by these other things. He's therefore perturbed or vexed in mind. He's frustrated because his desires are not gratified. And it's all his fault. Some years ago, I took a trip to Jamaica to spend a month with the missionaries of the poor. They needed some help with some local political regulation that needed to be worked through, and they asked if I would come and help them deal with some things. And so I went down there. I spent a month in the ghetto in Kingston, Jamaica, with the missionaries of the poor. Now, I'm a classicist. I love classical Greek and Roman culture. I love scholastic philosophy. I love Gregorian chant. I love Renaissance polyphony. I love medieval art. But I was in Kingston, Jamaica, in a third world ghetto, surrounded by people that I have nothing in this world in common with. The Mass was a Jamaican Mass every day. The music was Caribbean. There were lizards running around inside the church, even on the altar. It was open air. There were birds flying through during Mass. The people were some of the poorest people on earth. When it was time for a collection, people brought garbage bags that they brought from home with fruits and vegetables in them, and carried them up and laid them in front of the altar as their offerings. The place was like a circus. There was not a single thing that I liked about it. And yet, at the consecration during the Eucharist, I couldn't help but cry because I was so happy. I was so happy because I had the opportunity to contemplate God's presence in a place where I could never imagine God's presence to be. The same God who I pray to in my own private chapel, the same God I pray to in my own home parish, the same God I pray to in some of the most beautiful places, he was there in the midst of the ghetto. And so long as I went there seeking him, God himself, I was happy. And if Catholics would learn, and I'm not saying this to other Catholics, I'm saying this to myself as well, because I need to constantly keep this in mind, because it's so easy to be pulled away by our own human weaknesses. If we can focus on God himself and not allow any other things to distract us, we'll be happy as Catholics. We won't complain about liturgical issues. We won't complain about something someone else said. We won't complain about something someone else is wearing. We won't complain about whether someone is receiving communion on their tongue or in their hand. We won't complain that the music wasn't very good. We won't complain that the homily wasn't very good. We won't go to church looking to any human works for satisfaction. We'll go looking for God himself, and we'll find him, and we'll be happy. And the same is true everywhere we go. And when we see all of this complaining in modern Catholic circles, we often hear people complaining about the church, about society, about politicians, about the liturgy, about the Pope or bishops or whatever. We hear them complaining, and they complain as if their holiness and commitment to true religion and love for God moves them to complain, when in fact their complaining is revealing their lack of focus on God himself. Their lack of focus. Their complaining, their vexation, their unhappiness actually reveals that they are not seeking their happiness in God alone, but they are in fact weak and distracted. And yet these people are often followed around by even weaker people as being some kind of spiritual leaders. If you ever read church history, read the lives of the saints, you'll notice that the saints are often called into positions of authority and influence. And if you read, when these callings come to the saints try to run away from them. The saints want nothing to do with more authority or greater influence. The saints actually desire the opposite. They desire obscurity. They desire solitude. And the reason why the saints desire solitude is because they desire God alone. And they don't want any distractions. And so calling a saint from a quiet, contemplative life to some active vocation will always be met with resistance from the saint, because he knows that everything that he needs, he already has. And the question is, why would I go do that when everything that I need is right here? And God often needs to reveal to the saint that it's his will that the saint do this or that. And once the saint learns that it's God's will, then he can happily pursue it. And he pursues it because he understands the work rightly, and it helps him to focus more, not less, on God himself. And he finds happiness even in the most humiliating and toilsome undertakings. As long as the saint knows that God is there, he doesn't care what he has to do. But if he's not sure that God is there, he has no interest in pursuing it. And what we see in modern circles, in many places, is not saints seeking God through various apostolates for God, but we see men and women who are distracted and weak and unhappy because they've set their happiness in things not in their control, things outside of God. And as we say, misery loves company. They seek to gather a following to go with them in that unhappiness. So to be a happy Catholic, we have to stop avoiding the real question of religion, which is, what should we seek? Where is happiness to be found? Is it to be found in the Latin Mass? Is it to be found where there's Gregorian chant? Will happiness be found where everyone dresses modestly, where the priest is a scholastic theologian who delivers homilies that seem like something out of the writings of the doctors of the church? Does the church building need to be beautiful? Does the artwork need to be enchanting? The answer to all of these questions is no. We don't need any of these things. Though they are helpful for some, they can be helpful. Primarily for those who are weak and who need that help. But if we actually are faithful and mature and devout, we should be looking for God himself. And we should be increasingly independent of these lesser material means by which he sought. We should be separated mentally from these things. We shouldn't be dependent on these material crutches, but we should be seeking God himself. And if we seek God himself, what will we be but happy? Because we'll find him. We'll find him unchanged. We'll find him omnipotent. We'll find him infinitely wise, perfectly holy, everywhere we seek him. We'll be happy, though all the circumstances around us can be constantly changing, though all hell can break loose upon us. We'll find God in the midst of all of that chaos, even the worst suffering, the worst misfortunes, the greatest evils. We'll find what we seek just as he always is. And if we seek him and him alone, we'll be perfectly happy unconditionally, regardless of our circumstances. And this is what we need to do to be happy Catholics. Now you can see that if we lived this life focused and happy, and didn't allow ourselves to set our affections or expectations on any other things, we would desire a contemplative life. There would be more religious vocations, because when an 18 or 24 or 34-year-old man or woman is asked, "What would you like to do with your life?" that person will say, "I would like to worship God without distraction, now and forever." And they would have the opportunity to do that through contemplative life. And there would be a great number of Catholics signing up for religious life because it's simply true Catholicism. This lack of focus is why there's no interest in religious life. No one wants to pray all day. No one wants to meditate on God himself all day, all night, every day. And therefore, religious vocations to them are unattractive. I wasn't a Catholic when I entered into adulthood. And as a Protestant, I thought that marriage was where I would find happiness. And I was literally taught that in my Protestant circles, which is, of course, false teaching. Marriage is simply the means by which God draws us away from our worldly lusts and ambitions and leads us back to himself. Because we learn through marriage that our happiness cannot be found in another person. Marriage teaches us that. Marriage leads us to God. And so if we're not able to focus on God as young adults, God will use marriage as a means to lead us to focus on him as older adults. But it simply draws us to the same end. And now, as a married man, Having learned my lessons, I'm able to devote myself and focus on God even in the midst of married life without neglecting any responsibilities, enjoying my wife and children, fulfilling all of my duties to them, but no longer expecting to find happiness in those inferior and imperfect things. And this allows me to actually be a happy father and a happy husband and a diligent worker, a generous father, because I'm not seeking happiness in any of these things. I'm not expecting my children to be such and such to make me happy. I'm not expecting my wife to be such and such to make me happy. I am happy because my focus is on God, and God is always the same. He's always faithful. He's always present. He's always true. He's always good. And as long as I focus on God Himself and seek my happiness in God Himself, I enjoy a stability of mind and a happiness of soul that's unconditional, that's constant. And this happiness isn't dependent on any social or economic or political or liturgical circumstances. It's available to every single human being. But it's only available to those who do not allow themselves to seek gratification in anything else but in God alone. And if we learn to live like this, we'll be happy as Catholics, and all of the problems of this life will be solved. All of them. All of the problems are solved with this one simple remedy. You can't name a problem that isn't solved by this one certain remedy that's in our control. Every problem in this life is solved, remedied, cured by this one reality, that our happiness is to be sought in God Himself and in God, not in religion, not in Catholicism, not in the sacraments, not in the Bible, not in marriage, not in family life, not in business, not in politics, not in sports, not in food, not in physical pleasures. All of those things will leave us vexed, frustrated, angry, and yet we continue to turn to them. There's a proverb that says, as a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool to his folly. And this is what we do. We've been disappointed countless times by certain things in our life that we seek happiness in. We're disappointed by them again and again and again, and we go back to them and go back to them and go back to them, stuck in a rut, just to be frustrated again and again and again. Think how stupid divorce is. In divorce, two people who at one point believed that being together would lead them to happiness learn that the marriage relationship does not in fact bring them to that happiness. So what do? They end the marriage and seek another marriage. They go back to their folly and do it all over again. A person who has overeaten and been sick and overweight and unhealthy goes right back to the refrigerator to eat again, thinking that this time this food will make me happy. And they end up in the same misery all over again, cursing that food only to return to it all over again the next time. We do this in every area of our lives. We constantly look to things as if we desire God to be our last resort after we've exhausted everything else. And as long as there's one thing left to try, we're willing to seek that instead of God. And it doesn't matter how much we suffer, how much we lose, how unhappy we are, we continue to go back to these same broken cisterns, to use an illustration from Scripture, broken pots that can't hold any water. We go back to them again and again and again. And the idea of turning away from all of these things once and for all and devoting ourselves entirely to God once and for all is terrifying. It's terrifying because we still think that something else, some other thing might satisfy us. And we're afraid to do it. And yet, as I said before, none of us would ever admit that to be true. Every one of us would say, oh, I believe that happiness can be found in God alone. And yet, when we turn and look at our lives, we see that we don't actually practice what we claim to believe. And if we did make that resolution with God's help, we would be happy forever. And this is really the point of the Christian life. This is the goal of the Catholic life, to make this decision once and for all. That in God is happiness, and nowhere else. In God alone is my soul at rest, as the psalm says. Jesus said, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Do not seek the things the Gentiles seek, but seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And this is what we need to do as Catholics. We need to stop pretending that all of these other things are essential and practice real Catholic contemplative life. We need to actually practice the religion of the saints and not spend our time talking about saints. We don't need to talk about the rosary, because the purpose of the rosary is to draw our thoughts to God himself. If we're talking about the rosary, we're missing the whole point of the rosary. If we're talking about the Bible, we're missing the whole point of the Bible. If we're talking about the sacraments, we're missing the point of the sacraments. we can know when we've got things right when we're talking about God himself. As a Dominican, I learned that Saint Dominic was known for speaking to God or about God. He was either speaking to God in contemplation, or he was speaking about God to others. And that was it. That was his mission in life. He wished to speak to God or about God. If we find ourselves talking about other things, if we find ourselves upset about other things, frustrated about other things, we can deceive ourselves and pretend that we're religious. But our own soul, our unhappiness, and the subjects of our conversations will prove us to be deceiving ourselves. When we get it right, we'll be talking about God himself. We'll be thinking about God himself. We'll be reading about God himself. And when we reach that place mentally, we'll be happy. And our happiness will well up inside of us and will overflow. And it's that overflow of love and thankfulness and joy, that overflowing in our own life spreads from us to others. It's not an artificial friendliness. It's not a practiced marketing message that we need to learn and deliver to others. It's actually a personal happiness that simply overflows and affects those around us. When a bad thing happens, we don't get upset. We stay calm. We stay happy. And we deal with it calmly, happily. And that peace, that consolation, as St. Paul says, simply spreads from us to others. And that's the influence of the Christian life in our society. And so the answer to the question, how can Catholics be happy in this generation? It's for us to stop kidding around with all of these means and get to the end, which is God himself. Now, it's hard for us to do this because we have to immerse ourselves in sacred doctrine in order to do this. We have to immerse ourselves first and foremost in the sacred scriptures. Just think about it. Why would a person choose to read a book written by a saint rather than a book inspired by God himself? It's a matter of weakness that we would be impressed because this book was written by Saint so-and-so. And we're not impressed that this book was directly inspired by God himself. If we get this right, if we get our minds right, the scriptures will become our focus. And if you pay attention to the writings of the doctors of the church, you'll find that they don't write about other doctors of the church. What makes the doctors of the church special in the first place is that they are focused on God himself. Their book is the Catholic Bible. The writings of the doctors of the Church are filled with references to sacred scripture because that's where their faith actually comes from. It comes from their own study and contemplation in the inspired scriptures, in the Catholic Bible. So you have to commit to daily scripture reading in order to draw your mind into focus on God himself. Read God's own self-revelation in the scriptures. And secondly, if you're going to read anything outside of scripture, read about God himself. Read the Summa Theologica, the whole first part, on God himself. You'll find that the ideas that are taught by St. Thomas are very difficult to understand because we don't spend time thinking about God himself. We're not familiar with the ideas that we should be familiar with because we don't think about God himself. But I would recommend you study the scriptures regularly, constantly, as often as you can. Don't sit and watch a football game. Read the scriptures. Don't read some other book on some other topic. Read the scriptures. Or, like I said, read the writing of a doctor of the Church on God himself. It'll answer all the questions. All the other questions will be answered once you get this right. You'll understand how to be a good husband when you focus on God himself. You'll understand how to be a good father. You'll understand how to do honest business when you focus on God himself. You'll avoid making bad decisions when you learn to focus on God himself. You'll break all of your bad habits when you learn to focus on God himself. And in order to make this break, you have to make the break. In Romans, the passage that led St. Augustine to his conversion was, "Make no provision for the lusts of the flesh." It's either Romans 15 or 16. Make no provision for the flesh and its lusts. St. Paul said, "I buffet my body and make it my slave. I beat my body and make it my slave." You have to exercise control over your body like a man riding a horse would control that horse. You have to direct all of its energy, all of its strength, all of its attention to God himself. You have to subject all of your bodily desires to the pursuit of God himself. You have to make this choice. It's all or nothing. And it's once and for all. And this is the life that we see the saints living. This is the life we read about when we read about the saints. They're simply seeking God himself. We're seeking the saints. They're seeking God himself. That's the difference. That's the next step. That's where we move from learning about the Catholic life to actually living the Catholic life. And we're not going to be happy as long as we're simply present in Catholicism. We're not going to be happy until we actually practice Catholicism. And so if we want to be happy Catholics, we have to direct all of our attention and put all of our expectation, all of our hope for happiness in God Himself. And we'll find that God is the only one who can actually live up to that challenge. He's the only one who actually has the ability to satisfy us. He's made us very impossible to satisfy. We're never happy. And it's not because there's something bad about us. We're never happy because we've been created to enjoy God Himself. And everything else we do or seek will leave us unsatisfied. We judge that to be a weakness in us, but it's actually our greatest feature. It's what marks us and distinguishes us from all other creatures. We'll never be happy. We'll never be satisfied until we finally bet everything on God Himself. And we'll find that God accepts that challenge and can actually fulfill it. So if we want to be happy Catholics, we have to actually live the Catholic life. We have to actually live like the saints. We have to actually think like the doctors of the Church. We have to actually imitate Christ. And all that means is that we have to seek happiness in God alone. And when we do so, we will be happy. And our circumstances won't matter. We won't need perfect health. We won't need wealth. The church doesn't have to be perfect. The bishop doesn't have to be holy. The homily doesn't have to be wonderful. We'll be happy because we're focused on God and He makes us happy. And that happiness will become attractive to others. And they'll want to know how they can be happy. And the answer will be, seek God alone. It's very simple. Seek God alone. Put all of your expectation in God. Seek all of your happiness in God, and you will actually be happy.